now take you to the broadcast of It's Time with Rev Nathaniel W Martin. Here's Reverend Martin.
Hi, and welcome to It's Time. What is it time for, someone might ask? Well, it's still time for justice. We haven't got there yet. Ecological, environmentally, certainly not economically, which would include reparations, which is something that we are striving for, although the hill is hard to climb. But we keep pressing on, not because we may get there in my lifetime, but because any job that's worth doing well may take a lifetime to accomplish. And indeed, it cannot be accomplished alone, as Ryan Niebuhr said, and that nothing that is good and beautiful and true makes complete sense in any context of immediate history. Therefore, we must have not only patience, but faith and forgiveness. And so we press on in spite of all of those seeming obstacles that are in the way. Obstacles are what make you stronger, am I right? Obstacles are what help us to gain the mental strength and the psychological strength and the spiritual strength to withstand the storm. With no problems, we would be just plain spiritual weaklings, and God can't use no weaklings. You must be made strong. You grow strong through the problems, through the difficulties, through the obstacles, through the stumbling blocks, the mountains, the hills, the valleys, the rivers. You know the litany that we all must face in order to achieve a lifetime of work. So don't quit. Hang in there. Be encouraged by all means, regardless of the shame or the ridicule or the satire that you may be exposed to. Stay focused and stay in the fight. All right? Our marching orders from the Holy Scriptures, I always like to look at what Moses wrote in Deuteronomy chapter 24, beginning at verse 14. Find it very instructive. It says, "Thou shalt not oppress an hired servant that is poor and needy, whether he be of thy brethren or of thy strangers that are in thy land within thy gates. At his day thou shalt give him his hire, neither shall the sun go down upon it, for he is poor and setteth his heart upon it, lest he cry against thee unto the Lord, and it be sin unto thee." Notice, if you please, the opening words of that 14th verse, "Thou shalt not oppress." Hallelujah. We must not be oppressors. We must be enablers of all things. We must not oppress one another. And I fear that in our culture, and indeed all over the world, that is the norm. It's more observed in the breach than in the observance, as someone said quaintly many generations ago. And so to oppress, the old Hebrew word, carries with it an element of extortion. Extortion means I'm holding something against you by holding something from you. Is that right? Because the longer a person withholds what is due from the recipient, the worse the recipient's condition gets. That's not theoretical, that's practical. If you owe me $1,000 and my bills are $400 something, but I could pay them if you pay me my $1,000. Hey, you put me in a what? In a fix, in a bind, because I'm telling the people that I owe, I'm going to get the money, I'm going to pay you. And in the meantime, you what? Withholding my just due, my just funds. And so it is an element where you seem to be extorting me. Extortion means I'm going to hold this until you do that. And I might wind up, settling for a lesser amount say 600 or just 400 in order to just keep my head above water. God said, you're not supposed to do that. That's what God says. We shall not oppress and hireling, and the statement in the Old Testament that is poor. But the principle is a universal principle. You are not to oppress the other person, whether they are poor or whether they are rich, or neither rich nor poor. Say middle class for that reason. The principle remains the same. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you, as Jesus told the people in the New Testament. Is that right? And so these scriptures, these mores, these social conventions, they carry over even unto our very present hour and our very present time in which we now find ourselves. If I fail to introduce myself, I am Rev Nathaniel W Martin, pastor of the New Life Institutional Baptist Church right here in Los Angeles in Southern California, as it is popularly said. And we are grateful for you to give us these moments to talk about the social injustices and social inequities that seem to be the norm and not the exception, sadly, in our land. Is that right? There is much to be straightened out, much to be undone, much to be rectified or corrected, I guess would be a better word. In the history of our culture, things that have been historically done against the people, yes, black and white, and all other nationalities, as we hear and as we have heard. And so it keeps us prayerful, keeps us on the firing line, doesn't let us get weary, and it certainly doesn't let us get tired and go to sleep, because the giants just keep on coming. But notice that God recognizes that there is oppression in the world, even in the days of Moses and before there was oppression. Moses' people were oppressed when he was born. He was born in an oppressed society, but he was being raised in the home, the house of his people's oppressor. And he was exposed and allowed to associate with the elite of the oppressor class. And he was taught and he was educated and he was trained in the schools and in the ways and in the mores and in the culture of his oppressor. But he never forgot that he came from an oppressed people. That no matter how good his oppressor was treating him, he was doing it at the expense of Moses' people. And as Paulo Freire said, one of the worst things can happen is when the oppressed inculcates or digests or ingests the guidelines of his oppressor and begins to oppress and enable the further oppression of his own people. It's one of the worst outcomes that you can have. And fortunately, Moses did not yield to that temptation, but he realized that as good as things were for him, that they were not that good for the rest of his people. He saw them suffering. He saw them being whipped. He saw them languishing under their burden. He saw their mistreatment at the hands of their Egyptian overseers, and many times at the hands of their own people, who were, for a bit of a morsel of bread or wheat, more than the rest of the folks, gladly used the whip and the lash upon the backs of their brethren and their sisters. What a horrid condition, what a horrid development that oppression can bring about when it can make the oppressed turn and further oppress their own people for the slim advantages that they may feel that they get by showing the oppressor that I can be even more oppressive against my folks than you can. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? We have people all through society, all through the generations, who have yielded to the temptation and to accept the gratuities of the oppressor in order to enable and help the oppressor to further oppress their own brothers and sisters. But thank God, like Moses, there have been many who did not cater, who did not bow, who did not yield, whose eyes were open, and they said, I cannot participate in the destruction and the oppression of my own people. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Of course, it is a decision that each and every generation must make. Each and every person in that generation must decide, am I going to accept the advantages that the oppressor is offering me, even if it means that I become estranged and antagonistic toward my own people? These are thoughts and these are decisions that are forced upon every age, upon every generation. Some of you, all of us, have to make that decision at one point or another in our lifetime. Is that right? And the Bible is replete with Esther and the like, and the Mordecai who told her, it may be that thou art come to the kingdom for just such a time as this, and you cannot let your people down. But again, I began to sound rather Pollyannish, and believe me, I have both feet on the ground and both eyes wide open. I realize that the battle is tough, and the road is long, the mountains are high, the valleys are low, the river is deep and wide, but thank God he's on our side. I bring you now to consider the present candidate for the Supreme Court, one Brett Kavanaugh, who is a Georgetown University prep school graduate, who had all of the advantages of life seemingly handed to him. His mother was prestigious. His father was prestigious. He went to the right schools. He stayed in the right neighborhood. He had all the privileges of being white privilege, plus all of the advantages of being rich, well-to-do, well-placed. And as he said at the hearing, I busted my butt to get to Yale, not because I had anybody to introduce me to Yale, but we find that he had all kind of help coming up through the years. One of the strange things about Judge Kavanaugh is that he never tried a case. He's never a lawyer, in other words. He never was in a courtroom where a case was being tried. He was basically a law clerk and one that works behind the scenes in a judge's chamber, or as it was his case, in helping out other judges prepare briefs. But he himself never tried a case. Never. He worked as a law clerk first for a great big judge named Walter King Stapleton. And he was admitted to the Maryland bar in 1990. in the District of Columbia Bar in 1992. His way was paid for him. It was always upwardly mobile, and they were always making a way for this Judge Kavanaugh to succeed. If you read his limited bio and look at his achievements, you don't see why he ever tried a case in court. He was never in court. He was never a lawyer. Never a lawyer. Quite different from one of the other Chief Justice, not a Chief Justice, but Associate Justice of the Supreme Court, Thurgood Marshall, who did not get a chance to go to Georgetown Prep because Georgetown Prep was segregated during the time that Thurgood Marshall came along. When Brett Kavanaugh came along, all the schools were open. But when Thurgood Marshall came along, all of the schools were closed against black participation. He couldn't even go to the University of Maryland, which was in the state where he was born. He was born in Baltimore, talking now about Thurgood Marshall, juxtapositioning Thurgood Marshall to Brett Kavanaugh and how their roads or their careers were so different. And yet you find that Thurgood Marshall was more of an activist lawyer. You look at the cases that he fought before he ever got on the Supreme Court. Marshall was fighting what was one of the cases, Smith v. Allwright, which some of you might have forgotten. That's what helped overturn the Texas white only primary. White man's primary was called when I was there. It was had only been overturned the year after I was born. I was born in 1947, and the ruling that overturned it had just been issued, I believe, the year afterward, in 1948. And then he had fought Thurgood Marshall as opposed to Brett Kavanaugh, who's not fighting anything. But Thurgood Marshall was already fighting cases in the United States Supreme Court. He fought the case Sweat v. Painter, which was a case that Herman Sweat, who wanted to study law, and there was no law school in Houston, no law school in the state of Texas that would accept a person of color, a black person, colored person as we were known at that time. And so what he had to do was file a suit to get admission to the University of Texas, because the University of Texas had a law school. University of Texas was white only at that time. And so you can see where this is going. And the person who fought and won that case for Herman Sweat was none other than Thurgood Marshall. Now you juxtapose that against Brett Kavanaugh. Brett Kavanaugh seemed to be born with a silver spoon in his mouth. He never fought no cases. He never fought for no rights. He never was in the courtroom. And yet he's being elevated to the federal bench, the highest office in the land, Supreme Court. And these type of things are what we should consider. Keep in mind that when Thurgood Marshall was born there in the state of California, and indeed all over the country, and even in New York, Maryland, all around there, they had what you call restrictive covenants in real estate, saying that this real estate is exclusively to be sold only to other people of the homogeneous race or culture. That culture at that time was Caucasian or white. And so one of the cases that overturned that Thurgood Marshall, mind you, fought was a case called Shelley v. Kramer, where it was held by the United States Supreme Court that covenants, restrictive covenants, violated the due process or equal protection clause of the Constitution because they blocked a whole group of people from having equal access to housing. Great case. You should look it over because its effects were felt all across the nation at that time. I believe it was only 48 states. That's why I hesitated because the other two states didn't come in until much later. I think I was in elementary school in the 60s. I don't want to date myself. When Alaska became a state, and later on when Hawaii became a state. Thurgood Marshall was in the trenches fighting. One of the cases that Judge Kavanaugh cited was Brown v. Board of Education, 1954. Brown v. Board of Topeka, Kansas, which ended school segregation in schools, segregation in public transportation, and that was a momentous case, even cited by Brett Kavanaugh. Although when you look at Brett Kavanaugh's record as opposed to Thurgood Marshall's record, there is no peer, there's no equal. This looks like Kavanaugh got a easy ride all the way through. He went to the best white school. He stayed among the best white folks that there was. He had ample advantages, ample benefits, whereas Marshall had to fight, had to make a way for himself to even get in. And I'm not throwing shade on Brett Kavanaugh. I'm just looking at his career as opposed to the career of Thurgood Marshall. And now, President Kennedy asked that Marshall go to the Court of Appeals. Lyndon Baines Johnson elevated Marshall to Solicitor General. And look at the difference between Marshall and Brett Kavanaugh. Marshall won 29 of his 32 cases that he argued for the U.S. Supreme Court. When he was Solicitor General, he won 14 out of 19 of the cases that he tried on behalf of the U.S. government. Some of the greatest decisions of the country that really have benefited have been made by Thurgood Marshall, not by this numbskull. Here you have a conservative who was a graduate of Yale Law School, who has been seemingly to me made some of the most conservative decisions that this country has had to combat and to fight against. And I don't want to get down into the weeds. My time looks like it's moving so swiftly. But let's take the fact of him working with Kenneth Starr. And working with Kenneth Starr as an associate counselor. And he was working with Kenneth Starr when Kenneth Starr was working on the impeachment trial of Bill Clinton. You heard Kavanaugh make that big outburst. This is payback by the Clintons. Well, it was because one could say that he was the principal author of the Starr Report and on the Bill Clinton and Monica Lewinsky sex scandal. And he had argued on broad grounds for Clinton's impeachment. Compare that to the impeachable offenses of one Donald J. Trump, but yet he is not brought up on any charge. Is that right? It says here that Kavanaugh had urged Starr to ask Clinton sexually graphic questions and described Clinton as being involved in a conspiracy to obstruct justice, having disgraced his office and lied to the American people. The report provided extensive and explicit descriptions of each of the president's sexual encounters with Lewinsky, a level of detail which the authors described as essential to the case against Clinton. That's the person who shall soon be, 5 minutes, y'all, will soon be elevated to the Supreme Court. I had hoped that Senators Collins and Manchin and the other lady, Murkowski, and Senator Flake would be persuaded by the further FBI investigation and by the outburst of this impartial jury, so to speak, so-called, that they would have been influenced enough not to. But it looks like the work behind the scenes of George W. Bush, who is a good friend of Kavanaugh, have paid off. Looks like those Bushes get what they want. And because it was George Bush that nominated Kavanaugh to the United States Court of Appeals in 2003, although his nomination stalled in the Senate for nearly 3 years. Even back then, it was said that Kavanaugh was too partisan. But he made it. All right. And he has a lot of, in other words, political help in the background, which people like Thurgood Marshall did not have. All right. He was confirmed. And he began hearing cases. Let's see, what year was that? Doesn't really say. 2006. All right, 2006. And our environmental regulations, criminal procedure, separation of powers, and extraterritorial jurisdiction and human rights abuse cases. That's what we're dealing with now. And he will soon get a lifetime appointment to the Supreme Court. One good note before we close is that Officer Jason Van Dyke was found guilty of second-degree murder in the shooting death of Laquan McDonald. McDonald was shot 16 times by Officer Van Dyke, and he was found guilty of second-degree murder, which is only 6 years in Chicago, Illinois. But at least we got some modicum of justice. It's too bad that Lieutenant Burge could not have faced his day in court for the 40 years of tyranny and terror that he subjected black defendants to in the Cook County Jail. And we always are dealing with injustice. We must continue to fight injustice. We must never become weary, as the scripture says, in well-doing, for in due time you shall reap if you faint not. One thing I always say as I get ready to close, so I say it to you now and say it to you ever, with all the billions, millions, trillions of dollars that are floating around in this country, if somebody wants you to work for free and they don't want to pay you, as I said in the past, so I tell you now, I will tell you in the future, if they don't want to pay you, don't work for them. We out, Doc.